darkmyths.org, and Neapolis Media Group proudly present to you the Lone Gunman Podcast, featuring your host, Rob Clark, where research comes to shine and myths come to die. Stay tuned. Be right there.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the show. This is your host, Rob Clark. Welcome to another episode of the Lone Gunman Podcast. This week, we'll be taking a look at Jim Garrison's Mr. X. That's right, the inspiration for Fletcher Prouty's character in the movie JFK, as done by Oliver Stone. And this all spawned from an episode that Doug had done on the Dallas action about L. Fletcher Prouty. And it spurred me to dig a little deeper and see what else I could find about the man. And I recently did a show for ST over at Midnight Rider News, and called The Life and Lies of L. Fletcher Prouty. It is now in the vault, and you can go listen to it, and I recommend you do. Now, I've done a show or two in the past concerning the man we're going to be talking about here today. That is Richard Case Nagell. And when I heard that he was the inspiration for the X character in the movie JFK, the original X, Jim Garrison's Mr. X, it prompted me to go looking through the Garrison files to see exactly what kind of information they were getting from Richard Case Nagell. Now, before we get in and setting it all up, I wanted to play for you this week's question of the week. And I will just play it for you right now.
Welcome. This is Rob Clark, your host of the Lone Gunman Podcast. Your question of the week this week is, what is your favorite assassination-related book that you've read? Or what is one that you have not read yet that is definitely on your bucket list of assassination books to read? That's it. Have your voice heard, people. Stay safe. Peace.
I'll be honest here. My favorite is Destiny of the Republic, Candace Millard's 2011 portrait. And I listened to the Penguin Random House audio version read by Paul Michael, who does an excellent job. A really gripping story about that summer in 1881 with Guiteau's assassination attempt on Garfield. And I think it's just a really well-told story, even though it's interesting that Guiteau didn't succeed in the assassination. Garfield died anyway, and that, in terms of the tragedy of the circumstances of the state of medicine at the time, it's a fascinating story.
Well, thank you, Tim. And maybe I should have titled it Your Favorite JFK Assassination Books. But fascinating nonetheless. And thank you, Tim, for answering my question. And next we hear from Mr. Milton Cock. And by the way, I love your name, sir. Made me chuckle. It made me LOL.
Hello, Rob. Milton here. I actually like very much William Manchester's Death of a President. I don't necessarily agree with the conclusion re Oswald, but I don't think that's the point of that book. I think what it's very good at is detailing that small chronology from the 20th to the 25th and doing it in a very readable, well-written way. What I'd like to read, when I've got a few years on my hands, is Walt Brown's chronology, but that will perhaps have to wait for another time. Love you, good work. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Milton. Thank you, Milton. And yes, William Manchester's Death of a President, it should be required reading for anyone interested in the assassination, even though you don't have to, agree with the conclusions reached in that book. It is a very important and historical work, for sure. And as far as Walt Brown's assassination chronology goes, block out a couple years of your life, because that's how long it's going to take you to get through it. My best advice to you, get it on CD. And I believe it is searchable, which makes it even cooler, so you can actually search the topic that you're interested in him talking about. So that is a much, much easier way to get through Walt Brown's chronology. But an amazing work by him for sure, and definitely recommended for anyone out there. And thank you, Tim and Milton, for answering the question of the week. I appreciate it. And if you folks would like to have your voices heard on this show, go download the Swell app and search for @TLG Podcast and follow me. And you too can become a part of the show. Okay, now back to this show. There's a transition for you. Let's take a little listen, because when we talk about Richard Case Nagell these days, really the most important work done on him has been from Dick Russell. So let's listen to a short 4-minute clip of Dick Russell and Tyrell Ventura talking about Richard Case Nagell, and then we'll come back and get into the Garrison files concerning his Mr. X. So, be right back.
You did end up writing a book about Richard Case Nagell, The Man Who Knew Too Much. Tell us a little bit about that book and that investigation into this man.
Yeah, I waited 17 years for Nagel to tell me everything he knew, if he would, about the assassination. He never did. But I finally decided that I was going to set down what I knew about him for history and see where future investigation might go. He was arrested 2 months and 2 days before the assassination of President Kennedy outside a bank in El Paso, Texas, where he'd walked in and shot 2 holes in the ceiling and intentionally got himself taken into custody. Well, he had a notebook on him, which was released in 1975 when I started looking into him, which had some of the same notations that were in Lee Harvey Oswald's notebook, The Accused Assassin, for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, for the phone number of the Cuban Embassy in Mexico City. So I believe Nagel was worth looking into, and I knocked on his door and in Manhattan Beach, California, that fall of '75, and he ended up letting me in, and I ended up spending a lot of time with him. I went to work out there for TV Guide magazine as a staff writer in the late '70s, and ended up meeting Nagel in some dingy bars and piecing together a pretty amazing story, which had to do with Oswald being set up to take the fall, anti-Castro Cuban exiles posing as Castro agents, convincing him to get involved, supposedly, and then Nagel had taken himself out of the picture by walking into that bank. So my first book, The Man Who Knew Too Much, was a pretty exhaustive study of all this. In fact, friends called it the book that grew too much because it weighed in at 824 pages.
Oof, that's a hell of a book and a lot of research. So Richard really walked into a bank just to get himself arrested before the assassination happened, so he couldn't be tied. He had a great alibi, essentially, is what he was trying to set up for himself.
It looks that way. Wow. He was always rather vague about the specifics, but a policeman that I interviewed, in fact, the guy who arrested him, Jim Bundren in El Paso, remembered before the assassination, about 3 weeks beforehand, sitting with Nagel in a courtroom as he was about to be indicted, and he ended up being sent off to prison, convicted actually of attempted bank robbery, which was total bullshit. But anyway, he remembered Nagel saying to him, well, I'll tell you this, I'm just glad I'm not in Dallas right now.
Wow, that's incredible. That's incredible. How did he kind of fit into the assassination, like into the web of conspiracy? How did he, what part did he play in all of that?
It's a long, somewhat complicated story, but he had been a highly decorated soldier in the Korean War. He'd gone into military intelligence afterward, been in Japan when Oswald was there in the late 50s, and gotten an assignment from the CIA to keep tabs on him. Oswald then went off to the Soviet Union as a defector, or more likely a false defector, in some kind of military intelligence program. And then when he came back to Texas 2.5 years later, Oswald, that is, Nagel was assigned again, initially by the Russians, to keep an eye on him, to see what he might be up to in Texas. Nagel was a double agent for the Russians and the CIA. In other words, the CIA put him to work as a seeming Russian agent. And it was in that context that he uncovered not only one, but two other earlier plots to assassinate President Kennedy that involved anti-Castro Cuban exiles. And eventually, Nagel was ordered by the Soviet intelligence agency to either convince Oswald he was being set up on this deal as the guy who was going to take the fall, or kill him in Mexico City. And rather than do that, Nagel did try to convince Oswald, failed to do so, and then got himself taken out of the picture by walking into that bank.
So there you have the short Dick Russell version of the Richard Case Nagell allegations and hearsay. We're going to go through these documents in a somewhat organized timeline of events. And the first thing we're going to start with here is a letter that I found in the files from the desk of someone named Richard von Kleist. And it states in parentheses, copied verbatim as dictated. And it's not addressed to anybody, and it's not signed. We start at Hotel Luna, Mexico City in July of 1963. Parties included in plot were Alex Hidell, otherwise known as Lee Harvey Oswald, a female attorney who is a well-known communist in Los Angeles, blonde, about 35 years of age at that time. A hotel headwaiter, Fritty, first name unknown, who owned a launch believed to be shuttling between Mexico and Cuba. Also believed to be involved, Warren Brogy, a hotel chain manager, and Richard Case Nagell, former captain of the U.S. Army, associated with counterintelligence in Japan in 1959. Barbara Warren was involved with Alex Hidell and Brozy at the time the scheme was planned. Nagell sent a letter to J. Edgar Hoover warning him of a plot against Kennedy and naming Alex Hidell as one of the assassins. Hidell was not known to Nagell as Lee Harvey Oswald. He was known to him as Alex Hidell. The copy of the letter Richard Case Nagell wrote to J. Edgar Hoover on August the 13th of 1963, informing him of Oswald's plan to kill Kennedy, is being held by Nagell's sister, Eleanor Gambert, 8225 Grand Avenue, Long Island, New York. The letter contains information about Oswald, who was named and referred to as Alex Hidell, and advises Hoover that Kennedy would definitely be killed. The history of Richard Case Nagell is important. While a member of counterintelligence in Tokyo, he was dealing with a Soviet attaché officer stationed in the Russian embassy in Tokyo at the time. He was approached several times and was said to have dealt with said Russian officer as to vital information classified. A year or so later, Nagell was working for California Alcohol Beverage Control and was shot through the right chest when involved with a Los Angeles police officer because of communistic implications. He survived a gunshot wound and took off to Mexico or Cuba in a launch owned by Fritty of the Hotel Luna. All of this is and was known by J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI. Nagel was later arrested in El Paso for bank robbery after discharging a firearm in an El Paso bank. He was in Leavenworth Federal Prison for 2.5 years and was later brought to El Paso for an appeal. His appeal was denied, and from there he was sent to Springfield, Missouri, a federal prison, and is believed to still be there, now listed as a mental patient. Further information coming on Barbara Warren and a Dr. Fujiyama. So that's one of Nagel's big allegations, is that he sent a letter to Hoover in August of '63 warning him that Kennedy would be killed by a man named Alex Heidel. And the big problem is every attempt to obtain a copy of this letter. Now, Nagel said he had a copy. He also said that his sister had a copy, and that, of course, obviously, the FBI had a copy. No copies have ever surfaced of this letter. Now, when it comes to Richard Case Nagell, he is a very odd fellow. He survived a plane crash and was determined to have suffered some kind of brain damage. It's unclear exactly what was wrong with him. At times, what I'm seeing, just from things that he has written, he was a very, very intelligent man. Very, very neat handwriting, not the scribblings of a lunatic. And you'll see here, very methodic, planned. I mean, he even typed out his proposed testimony at his appeal. And this is from September 19th, 1966. The proposed testimony of Richard Case Nagell as written by Richard Case Nagell. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I think I am correct in saying that the purpose of the trial adversary system is to bring out the truth, preferably the whole truth, surely nothing but the truth, so that just a verdict may be reached in accordance with the law. As I understand it, a trial called pursuant to American standards of jurisprudence is not meant to turn into a game whereby the truth is sacrificed for convenience or withheld to accommodate a circumvention of relevant fact. Nor is the system designed for staging a pageant of subtle misrepresentations in order to gratify everybody but the defendant that justice is being administered. This is precisely why I have taken the stand, because this trial has evolved into something more than a contest between the prosecution and the defense, with both sides seeking to win the day through the presentation of carefully selected witnesses, some of them misinformed, many of them mistaken, and deceptive evidence, while evading, by mutual agreement, vital material issues that would allow the court to view my case in its proper perspective. Consequently, the truth, or at least a vast area of the truth, has not been produced at this trial, nor was it produced at my initial trial in 1964. As a matter of fact, the truth in my case has never been raised to the surface, despite the certainty that a great deal of it is known to the government. Thus, I have elected to testify in order to ensure that for once the truth is made available for consideration by this court, even though I possess absolutely no hope of gaining tangible benefit from my testimony. I shall, however, as my story unfolds, be given the satisfaction of knowing that my former colleagues will now be able to ascertain why I did what I did on September 20th, 1963, and why my case has been prosecuted with such diligence, and why, since the very beginning, my defense has been directed along the route leading to confinement in a mental institution if I should, by some fluke, be acquitted. Before I get to the meat of my testimony, I feel it pertinent to advise the court that such testimony will necessarily link me, however obliquely, with a domestic-inspired, domestic-formulated, and domestic-sponsored conspiracy to assassinate a chief executive of the United States and other highly placed government officials. But I want it to be clearly understood that this link stemmed from my cognizance of the conspiracy rather than my participation in it. Also, I wish to advise at this point that it was, in my soon-to-be qualified opinion, a direct result of my arrest that this conspiracy did not materialize, and that if the FBI had bothered to consider even a cursory inquiry into my allegations regarding the conspiracy of one of its original perpetrators, Lee Harvey Oswald, President Kennedy would still be alive. Further, I wish to advise that I made every reasonable effort under the prevailing circumstances to testify before the Warren Commission when it was in session. Now I shall advance 5 premises which will eventually, I am sure, be proven to your satisfaction. The first being that the reason I did what I did in the bank 3 years ago was for the sole purpose of having myself arrested and detained temporarily by federal authorities. Second, that prior to my arrest, I had notified the Federal Bureau of Investigation by registered mail of a pending conspiracy to murder the President of the United States during the latter part of September 63. Third, that since the date of my arrest, during my appeal from conviction, and prior to this trial, I was beaten, intimidated, and coerced by the authorities because I refused to talk and or give information, and on one occasion, when I refused to submit to hypnosis by a psychologist at Leavenworth, I was forcibly administered a dangerous drug until my physical condition commanded it be stopped. That also at Leavenworth Penitentiary I was subjected to a 10-day period at what can at its best only be described as brutal treatment, because I refused to answer questions. Fourth, that I am not now, nor have I ever been, insane or otherwise devoid of my mental faculties, nor have I ever attempted suicide, though I have made gestures in that respect for good reason. Fifth, that the defenses of incompetency or insanity, call it what you may, was literally forced upon me by this court in April of 64, as were the services of its appointed attorneys. That after my conviction in May 64, it became mandatory for me to abide by such defense and cooperate in such defense in order to secure a reversal of my conviction. That the prosecution has, in collusion with my court-appointed attorneys, suppressed crucial material evidence which would have sanctioned, if not demanded, another avenue of defense, my true defense, and lastly, that a number of my so-called constitutional safeguards, including, but not limited to, the right to subpoena witnesses, cross-examine witnesses, and retain legal counsel of my own choosing, have been denied by this court. In order for the interested parties to better comprehend the reasons for my actions on September 20th, 1963, and to avoid confusion, I must cite certain past events concerning myself which, rightly or wrongly, influenced my decision to do what I did. Everything I am about to say is germane to this hearing, and I say it not in excuse, but in explanation. So, that is how he proposed that he was going to start off his appeals trial. So, does that sound like the ramblings of a madman to you? Somebody insane? Or somebody that was denied, a fair trial the first go-around and wasn't able to explain his actions, and now wants to? And in fact, probably was told at the first hearing not to take the stand. And this time around, he wants to take the stand so that the truth is finally out there. So, you heard the way. That's the writing of a very intelligent man. I'm sorry, it just is. But obviously, this appeals trial did not end well, as he was sent to the Springfield Mental Hospital to do out the rest of his term. And this prompted him to write a letter in January of 67 to the Honorable Dick Russell, of the United States Senate. Interesting that Dick Russell would be the one to write his book many, many years later. Not the same Dick Russell, of course, but interesting nonetheless. It's called Serendipity, folks. Look it up. This letter states, Dear Senator Russell, reference is made to the enclosed clipping, which is, I believe, self-explanatory. In regard thereto, I would urge, rather than attempting to learn more about Mr. Oswald's stay in the USSR and his, quote, dealings with the pro-Castro committee, unquote, that any future inquiry be directed along more productive lines. Further, I suggest that any field investigation deemed necessary be conducted by an agency that has no private axe to grind, such as the FBI. Mr. Oswald and his activities came under my scrutiny during 62 and 63. My inquiries, coupled with the date furnished me by reliable sources, ascertained the following. Mr. Oswald had no significant connection with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. He had no significant contact or relationship with so-called pro-Castro elements, though he was led to believe he had such. He maintained no significant association with any Marxist-oriented group or movement. He was not affiliated with a racist group or movement. He was not an agent or informant in the generally accepted sense of the words for any investigative, police, or intelligence agency, domestic or foreign. He was involved in a conspiracy to murder the former chief executive during the latter part of September 63. This conspiracy was neither communist inspired, nor was it instigated by any foreign government or organization or individual representative of any foreign government. In the summer of 63, I received instructions to initiate certain action against Mr. Oswald, who was the indispensable tool in the conspiracy, and thereafter depart the United States legally. Although I did neither, I did, subsequent to obtaining a valid passport and prior to my arrest, dispatch a letter via registered mail to the director of the FBI, advising in sufficient detail of the aforesaid conspiracy and the identity of Mr. Oswald. After the tragedy at Dallas, when I became convinced that the FBI was more concerned with keeping me in custody, as with cleaning its dirty linen, than it was in resolving facts, which would have shed light on the assassination, I clammed up completely. Later, however, when I felt I was going to be railroaded into either a prison or a mental institution, I made every reasonable effort under the existing circumstances to testify before the Warren Commission. I even sent letters to the Chief, Secret Service Division, and Mr. J. L. Rankin, then General Counsel for the committee. For what little it is apparently worth now, my opinion is that the death of President Kennedy was indirectly, if not directly, resultant from a conspiracy and also due in great part to the stupidity and negligence of the FBI, that Mr. Oswald definitely was the only assassin, and that his own demise was not attributable to any conspiracy of which I was cognizant. Very truly, Richard Case Nagell. Okay. So he's sending that to Richard Russell in early 67. Sounds to me like Richard Case Nagell has a lot to say and nobody wants to listen to the man. So let's move on to a letter from, I believe, let me check here. Richard Popkin, author of The Second Oswald. And this letter was written in March of 1967 to the Office of the District Attorney, City of New Orleans, Louisiana. Dear sirs, the following might be of interest to you. At the time the following events occurred, mostly alluded to events, to be sure, I was too wary to pursue them, too frightened would be a better description. In March of 63, I was befriended by a Richard Nagell, an ex-captain of the infantry, Korean War, and ex-CIA agent. The first claim was proven. The second was, of course, impossible to confirm. At the time, I was proprietor of a left-wing bookstore in Los Angeles Police Department's Red Squad description, and an executive officer of the Los Angeles Fair Play for Cuba Committee. All right, let me back up. This is not from Richard Popkin. This is allegedly from Harry Dean, using an alias of Don Morgan. Okay. Nagel's behavior was cautious and quiet. After a series of conversational encounters, he showed me what amounted to a scrapbook of his life. The news clippings were authentic. I checked them out. I cannot attest naturally to the photostatic copies of personal documents. In fine, ex-Captain Nagel was a mysterious figure, and in my semi-professional judgment, certainly not a paranoid schizophrenic. He was checking me out, slowly, carefully, for a reason unknown to me even today. I checked out some of his record. He was a highly decorated war hero. He was critically injured in a plane crash somewhere in Cambodia in '57, while, as he claims, he was in the employ of the CIA. He was almost shot to death in Long Beach, California in 1960 by an unknown assailant. He wouldn't talk about it. While critically wounded by a .38 caliber bullet in his chest, he hired a cab driver to take him 30 miles to a Santa Monica hospital, where he entered under an alias. Suddenly, in August of '63, he left Los Angeles, leaving me only a cryptic note saying something about contacting me later, and that certain people in certain circles thought very highly of me, whatever that meant. In March of '64, he sent me 2 letters from El Paso, Texas, allegedly smuggled from jail. He was, I learned, being held for armed robbery. The first letter was a curious request that I, if questioned, be sure to attest to his right-wing leanings, and that I take into consideration the events in Dallas might have been a tragic blunder. The second letter was a request to mail out a series of letters in the form of a prepared press release to the Warren Commission, LA Times, New York Times, and others, reporting that he had been overheard to say during his arraignment that the FBI held full responsibility for Kennedy's assassination, and that he was immediately led out of the court by federal men. The second letter began, as did the first, with the information on the return addresses on the envelopes were phony and to disregard them. The street names and numbers were identical, and the city was El Paso. In checking, true, they were fictitious. No such El Paso street. But there was such a street and number in Los Angeles. It was 2 doors away, I discovered from Richard Nagel's mother's house. I secured her phone number, called her, using an assumed name, pretended to be an old army buddy who had accidentally met Richard a few months ago, and asked, what the hell, anyway, was the meaning of the strange postcard I received from him from El Paso saying he was in trouble. It took almost half an hour to assure her that I was what I said I was before she admitted that, 1, the FBI had told her not to talk to anyone. 2, they assured her Richard was sick. 3, she felt something was very wrong. 4, Richard somehow knew something about the assassination. She would not tell me what he had been arrested for and convicted of. She would only say that I should go to the town from which the letters were mailed. 2 years ago, my wife and a friend read all of the Mar correspondence between Richard and me, and reviewed the facts and burned the paperwork. In fine, we were scared. It would be silly of me not to be frightened even today. If you wish to talk to me, place an ad reading, Don Morgan, contact Jim immediately, in the Berkeley Barb, 2421 Oregon Street, Berkeley, California, which is a weekly newspaper. If not, good luck with your investigation, gentlemen. You will certainly need it. Sincerely yours, Don Morgan, an alias. P.S. I do not know Nagel's whereabouts, except that he was convicted and was last reported in a Texas federal prison. Interesting. Very interesting. And I'm not 100% sure that this was actually from Harry Dean, although he was a member of the Los Angeles Fair Play for Cuba Committee, allegedly, undercover for the FBI. And there is some interesting letters that I don't know if I have or not, between certain researchers who are asking to get Harry Dean to pose for a photograph, and he won't. And they're discussing how to possibly get an unposed photograph of Harry Dean for comparison to show Nagel. So, my best guess is that this Don Morgan character is Harry Dean. Now, this is interesting. Again, I told you how methodical and intellectual Richard Case Nagell is. Now, on April 5th, 1967, after being contacted by the DA's office, Richard Case Nagell sent them a term of conditions. On April the 5th, 67, following are the conditions required by Richard Case Nagell, under which the described matter will be made available to DA Jim Garrison. Quote, that I shall not be charged as an accessory or held as a material witness or prosecuted for concealing and withholding evidence relative to this inquiry. That I shall in no manner be identified outside of official channels as having supplied information or material relative to his inquiry, or as having been connected with such inquiry in any way. That I shall not be required to disclose how the recording tape came into my possession, or queried on any alleged relationship with the individuals whose voices are recorded thereon. That the person who currently has possession of the recording tape not be identified outside of official channels, nor be questioned, subpoenaed, arrested, or held in custody for any cause or suspicion stemming from this transaction. That only the recording tape germane to the inquiry be taken. All other recording tapes, films, photographs, documents, tracks, equipment, and other paraphernalia found in or about the premises designated not be confiscated or examined, except that all recording tapes in the Spanish language may be examined on the premises if there arises doubt as to which one is applicable. That upon demand a verbatim transcript of the conversation recorded on the applicable tape be turned over to me. That the person who currently has possession of the aforesaid objects and paraphernalia be allowed to dispose of them, this applicable tape accepted, pursuant to my written instructions without delay or interference. That no search warrant be requested or issued in this matter, entry to the premises designated and the conduct of the inspection therein be effected under the supervision and control of the person to whom my letter of introduction is addressed. That no private, local, state, or federal investigative or law enforcement personnel or agency, other than the one to which this stipulation applies, be notified of the time, date, or location of such inspection, or of any information related thereto, until 1 week has expired from the date such inspection is completed. And he has a line here that says, agreed to by Jim Garrison. Sign here, please, sir, and get back to me. So, what he was referring to in that letter is he said that he had an audio tape of a meeting that took place in Mexico City in which Oswald can be heard on the tape, though not referred to by name, but that his voice is definitely on the tape. And that he would turn that over to Jim Garrison. So I'm assuming that Jim Garrison signed this request, and he dispatched the Assistant District Attorney William R. Martin to the Federal Prisoners Medical Center at Springfield, Missouri, to go talk to Richard Case Nagell. And we have a very multi-page report here on it. I'm just going to hit the highlights, okay? On Monday morning, April 10th, 67, 7:30 a.m., I departed New Orleans for Springfield, Missouri, aboard Delta Flight 836. The purpose of this trip was to interview the subject identified above, who had offered himself as an informant to this office. Upon arrival in Springfield at 11:17, I retained yellow cab number 9 and was driven directly to the Federal Center. The guard requested I fill out a visitor form, and then he took my completed form and the subject's record jacket elsewhere in the building out of my sight, and returned at about 10 or 15 minutes and stated that I would be allowed to visit the subject during regular visiting hours from 1 to 3. By this time it was 12:20, so I elected to have yellow cab number 9 wait for me. So then, I mean, it's very, like I said, it's very detailed. And of course, you know, it should be. This is legalese stuff here. He says the subject was brought into the visiting room promptly at 1 p.m. on April 10, 1967 and brought to my area of the room by the guard supervising the general visiting area. After shaking hands with the subject, we both took seats on opposite sides of the table, and the subject opened the conversation immediately by saying that he was sorry that he had caused me to make this long trip from New Orleans for no purpose at all. He stated that he had given the matter much thought, and that he decided that it would be useless and not in his own best interests for him to give anything to this office or to turn over any material or evidence to us. He stated he was worried about recent events and was at this point afraid to confide in anyone. He elaborated that he had become very suspicious of just about everyone and was extremely upset by the way, quote, things were being handled. Further prompted, the subject stated that he had asked his sister to contact Garrison personally and had given her explicit instructions as to how he wanted this contact to be established. He had said that his sister had gone about things in exactly the wrong way and that she and her husband were trying to play amateur detective. He stated that recently his brother-in-law had visited him in Springfield and attempted to interrogate him very closely about this case and other matters in his past, but that he, Nagel, had decided to trust absolutely no one, and that he would simply let his case and everything pertaining to it remain in the status quo. So it goes on, he says the subject was quite interested and willing to reveal to me certain things about himself and about the depth and complexity of his own case and of his personal past life. He stated to me that he had been a very bad boy for a very long time, and that no one knew of this since he had never discussed his personal beliefs of his personal activities with anyone, and had always concealed his activities with a good cover or front. He stated he had been involved in certain activities which could get him in a tremendous amount of trouble if the activities became known, and that he would probably wind up spending the rest of his life in prison if anyone ever discovered exactly and could prove exactly what he had been up to. He stated to me that he had been a Marxist-Leninist for many years and that he had no particular love or loyalty to the United States. Sound familiar, folks? The subject became intensely curious about our investigation, and as our conversation progressed, he stated he was pleased to see that I was willing to bring him up to date on our investigation insofar as the non-confidential aspects were concerned, and he stated that he was certain that at this stage of the game we too had our hands full of amateur sleuths who were coming out of the woodwork. At this point, the subject stated that this was precisely the professionalism he was looking for when he asked that he be contacted by Mr. Garrison. But you remember, the subject stated that he had seen Mr. Garrison on television. Mr. Garrison's statement that "let justice be done, though the heavens crumble," and that he had been very much impressed with this statement and had hoped to be able to assist Mr. Garrison in so doing, ultimately assist himself and benefit his own position. At this point, I assured the subject that any information or material he released to Garrison's office would be handled with the strictest confidence and that it would receive the most competent and professional treatment that the office could make available. He stated that there had been 3 separate plots to kill Kennedy. The first plan was to kill President Kennedy by bombing a concealed bomb in the speaker's platform or the speaker's podium on the occasion of December or January of '62, when the president traveled to Miami, Florida to address a group of Cuban prisoners who had taken part in the Bay of Pigs invasion and who had just been released and returned to the States. A second and similar plan to kill the president was to have taken place in June of '63, when the president had traveled to Los Angeles for an important speaking engagement. The subject stated that the first and second plots never really become serious and that the plans never did reach more than just the talking stage. The third and final plot, which did in fact end with the assassination of Kennedy, was an offshoot of the other 2 plans and was planned and put into effect by the same group of people. The subject stated that these plots to kill President Kennedy had involved several men, some of them Cubans, and that all 3 plots had been based along the same thinking and logic. So he goes on, he doesn't name names, and he says that at this point the subject became rather nervous and seemed to be reluctant to continue his description of what had been what had taken place in connection with the Kennedy assassination. He asked a variety of questions concerning the theories on which Mr. Garrison had been working, and whether or not we had received or had been offered any cooperation by the CIA or the FBI. I assured the subject that insofar as the Kennedy assassination was concerned, that this office was working entirely independently of any other organization, and that we did not believe the FBI or the CIA could be inclined to offer us any assistance. At this time, the guard in the visitor's room announced that visiting hours were over, and the subject and I were forced to take very rapid leave of each other. Prior to departing, the subject asked me if I could possibly stay in town and return during the next visiting hours, and I assured them that I had no intention of leaving town until after he had told me everything he had to say. This concluded my first interview with subject Richard Case Nagell at 3 p.m. on April 10th, 1967. Upon leaving the visiting area, I asked to speak to the prison social director, Mr. Matthews, and to the classification and parole officer in charge of the subject's case. Neither of these gentlemen were available to speak, and I was asked to return later in the afternoon to see them, and I was also asked to leave a message as to the nature of business I had with them. I left word that I wished to make arrangements for a privileged attorney-client interview with the subject, since I had not been satisfied with our meeting in the public meeting room. For the rest of the day and during the morning of the next day, both of these men successfully avoided and evaded my attempts to see them in their offices. Tuesday morning at 8:30, I continued my interview with the subject, Richard Case Nagell. So without preliminaries, Mr. Nagell continued our conversation exactly where it had been interrupted the day before by asking me what theory Mr. Garrison was working on in regards to the assassination of President Kennedy. So it goes on and on and on. They talk about Bay of Pigs, CIA, Cuban refugees. It's a lot of Nagell fishing for information. So when we get to the tape, he says, concerning the content of the tape recording in question, the subject stated that it was a tape recording made of a conversation of 4 individuals, and that the tape was primarily in Spanish. Although on certain occasions in the tape, certain of the participants lapsed into English. When questioned as to the identity of the person speaking on the tape, the subject stated openly that one of them was Arcacha, that'd be Sergio Arcacha Smith, and another individual whom the subject would only identify as Q. Quiroga, maybe? The subject did not wish to go into more detail concerning the tape at that time, since he, all during our previous conversations, had indicated that our conversation could possibly be bugged. So then they go on about how they're going to try to get this tape from either a sister or a friend. The friend had instructions to destroy anything and everything that had been left in his safekeeping. So maybe the only possibility was getting in touch with his sister. But now his sister and his brother-in-law are acting crazy, and he doesn't trust them. So when left to his impressions and opinions, William Martin says this: the subject, Richard Case Nagell, is an extremely articulate and well-spoken individual who seems to have full command of his senses and total recall of his activities, and constantly maintains or mentions dates, times, and places that pertain to matters concerning this investigation. He is of the opinion that he will be forced to complete his full 10-year prison sentence, of which 6 remain, unless he offers to cooperate with the FBI. It is his impression that the cooperation would mean the release to the FBI of all the material incident with his association with the Soviet embassy in Moscow, and he is not willing to do this. Mr. Nagell stated to me that in 6 years from now, when he is released from prison, he will then be forced to make a final decision of either leaving this country forever or remaining in this country in good standing forever. It is his opinion that everything will depend on how the aforementioned box or trunk concerning his possessions is handled. I received the impression that Mr. Nagell does not really care. one way or the other, whether he leaves this country or not in 6 years, since he feels that it is possible for him to live in peace either in the United States or in the Soviet Union, depending on the circumstances at that time. Although Mr. Nagel stated to me that he felt no particular loyalty to the United States and had worked with the Soviet Union as a matter of principle and personal convictions, he also stated to me that the release of this tape recording to Mr. Garrison was his first step in seeing what he could do to square himself with his country. At this point, the guard in the visiting area announced that the visiting hours were up, and I parted with my promise to return to Springfield within a few days to attempt to see him under privileged visiting conditions. So that was the end of day 2. And then he speaks a little bit about his meeting with a Mr. Loftus. Who is Mr. Loftus? Throughout the following day, Wednesday, April the 12th, I remained with Mr. Loftus in his law offices, reviewing the procedural aspects of handling of prisoners in both Leavenworth and the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield. Mr. Loftus, who has had a good deal of experience with inmates at Leavenworth, is of the opinion that there will be no difficulty in obtaining privileged communications with the subject once he is transferred back to Leavenworth. He also stated that privileged communications should be able to be obtained in Springfield, but only at the request of the prisoner. This was basically the same info which had been obtained in Springfield, and I departed Kansas City on the 12th of April to return to New Orleans on Braniff Flight 241. Every effort will be exerted to obtain the letter in question from the subject and subsequently to obtain the tape recording referred to by Mr. Nagel. Now, do you think that tape recording with Sergio Arcacha Smith on it and someone referred to as Q would be pretty damning? Yeah. Oh, yeah. And we know Garrison was really looking hard at Sergio Arcacha Smith, and he also had his eyes on Carlos Quiroga, Carlos Bernier. So, very interesting stuff here, folks. And you heard it from the assistant DA. This man seems fine, very articulate, very intelligent, and not mentally ill at all. So, now on April 28th, William Martin receives a letter from the United States Bureau of Justice, or Department of Justice, Bureau of Prisons, Springfield, Missouri. It says, "Dear Mr. Martin, I regret that I must return your letter pertaining to Mr. Nagel in that he has refused to accept it. It appears that his reaction is completely out of proportion, since he has also requested his caseworker to remove all persons on his official correspondence list except for magazines and newspapers. Your dedication to this man is remarkable. Sincerely, R.S. Nicholas, Chief Classifications and Parole." So, now it appears Nagel is backtracking and refuses to accept a letter from William Martin to kind of have privileged conversation, because the detainee has to request it, almost as if he is his counsel. So, on May 11th, William Martin fires off a memo to Jim Garrison concerning Richard Case Nagell. And he goes through and explains everything. Let's see. The subject was willing to discuss the contents of the tape recording, but asked that I not push him for too many details. He stated that he had perhaps been a little over-optimistic when he first spoke to me concerning the tape recording, when he had said that the tape recording would wrap the case for us. He stated that the tape recording would merely serve to show conclusive proof of a plot to kill President Kennedy. He stated that there were 4 voices on the tape, one of which was his own voice, but that he was acting as interpreter only. He implied that the person for whom he was interpreting was silent through the meeting, and that his voice is not heard on the tape for that reason. He further stated that there was reference to persons and places in the tape recording, but that the names and places used were cover names and did not literally mean what they said. For example, he stated that the name Raul appears on the tape, but that Raul is a cover name for a man whose true name he will not disclose. He also stated that there is a reference to San Juan, Puerto Rico on the tape, but this is a cover name for Mexico City. He stated that the persons who were being tape recorded were not aware that they were being put on tape, and they probably would have shot him if they had learned what he'd done. He also then stated that the tape was made on the 20th or 21st of August, 63. But it should be specifically noted that later during the interview, when I asked the subject again what dates the tape recording covered, he stated that the tape recording covered roughly the 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th, and September of 63. Now, we know Oswald was on the radio and TV shows in New Orleans on, I believe it was the 20th or 21st of August, if I remember right. Conversation carte blanche. He says, we then begin to discuss the method of obtaining the tape from the subject's friend. He says his friend would probably give me the tape recording even if I were to approach him without the letter written by him. So here we start to see the beginnings of some odd behavior from Richard Case Nagell. Continuing the general discussion of the subject, asked if the district attorney's office was aware of a man in San Antonio who owned a 6.5 millimeter Mannlicher Carcano rifle. The subject stated that this man had known Lee Harvey Oswald and had been seen with him on many occasions. So then he went in the office of Mr. Nicholas. And Mr. Nicholas casually inquired about my relationship with the subject, and he was interested to learn what grounds I was going to use to appeal the subject's case to a higher court, and what the nature of the defense would be. I avoided any direct answers or any form of conversation concerning the subject, but maintained a friendly and polite attitude to Mr. Nicholas inasmuch as he was the individual responsible for arranging the privileged meeting with the subject. In the process of going through the subject's file, see, they were doing all this a little clandestinely. They were telling the Bureau of Prisons that this William Martin was going to be Nagel's attorney for another appeal, when actually he was not. He was just trying to get information for the Garrison investigation. So they're talking about this privileged meeting, and he says after a minute or two, Mr. Nicholas looked up from his desk, and he said, "Just a minute, Mr. Nagel will be with you very shortly." At this time, Mr. Nagel, who was not yet in my line of vision, stated, "Never mind, Mr. Nicholas. I think I've heard enough as it is." The subject continued by saying that he had overheard Mr. Nicholas and myself speaking, and that he had changed his mind about confiding in me, and that he did not want to associate with me in any manner, and did not want to speak with me at all. Mr. Nicholas and I both attempted to calm the subject down. He was visibly shaken, pale, and moving his hands about in an extremely nervous manner. After a few moments, I was able to convince Mr. Nagel that he should sit down with me in private at least long enough to tell me what was on his mind and what had upset him so much. So he managed to calm him down. He says, the subject kept repeating, "I am not a fool, Mr. Martin. What do you take me for, a fool?" This private meeting with Mr. Nagel occupied some 3 to 5 minutes, only after which time he arose abruptly from the table and stalked into Mr. Nicholas's office and demanded that he be returned to wherever he had been when he was called down to the meeting. Mr. Nicholas was as surprised as I was over the behavior of the subject, and spent 10 or 15 minutes with me after the subject had departed, and discussed with me the subject's background, which had made his conduct possible. Mr. Nicholas also called the physician who had been supervising the subject's care, and whom the subject had come to be rather fond of, and the three of us held a lengthy conversation concerning the subject and what could be done to calm him down and re-establish a rapport with him. Sounds like Mr. Nagel didn't get his meds that day or something. So his conclusions and opinions from this visit. According to statements made to me by the subject, I am in possession of enough information concerning the tape recording and the subject's friend who is holding the tape recording that I should be able to obtain the tape recording without benefit of the letter the subject was going to write. This conclusion is based on what the subject himself told me when he admitted to me that he had overemphasized the security of his possessions being held by his friend. I was told by the subject's physician that the subject had earlier suffered severe brain damage in an airplane accident and that he also suffered from acute paranoia. The physician stated that within a few days the subject might have an equally strong and opposite reaction to his one at our last meeting and might be anxious to see me again. Based on this information, it is possible to conclude the subject might suffer a change in his present attitude and might ask for me to return to Springfield. Based on my personal knowledge of the subject and of the circumstances of his case, which he has described to me, which include a chronic fear of betrayal by almost everyone, I do not feel at this time that the subject will be willing to continue our relationship. A letter will be written to the subject in an effort to calm his fears and to reestablish our relationship. So, the first cracks in the armor of Richard Case Nagell become visible to the Garrison investigation. Very interesting stuff. May 12th memo to Jim Garrison from William Martin. On the morning of April 25th, I had a rather lengthy meeting with clinical psychiatrists of this city, and with his very valuable assistance, composed a letter to Mr. Nagel, which, according to the psychiatrist, would be most likely to produce the desired results. The letter to Mr. Nagel was returned to me from the Federal Medical Center with a letter signed by Mr. Nicholas stating that the subject had refused to accept my letter and that he had requested that all persons be removed from his official correspondence list. Now on June 20th, we have a letter from Martin to Nagel. Dear Mr. Nagel, after my most recent visit with you at the Springfield Medical Center, I traveled briefly to interview the witness that you had indicated as being valuable to your appeal and to obtain from him evidence that he might have had. Fortunately enough, I was able to locate the witness with absolutely no trouble and managed to spend several hours in amiable conversation. I was much impressed by this individual, by his dignity, bearing, and loyalty. I am satisfied in my own mind that he would have helped in every possible manner in the legal battle that lies ahead. Unfortunately, however, the physical evidence that I had hoped to obtain was not available. Apparently, it was the subject of a burglary sometime in '64 and was the only item of interest to the burglar, who did not disturb, as so far as can be determined, any other items of value, so I am told. In any case, I was interested in nothing else. Of course, I will continue the preparation of our case with all diligence, but I wanted you to know that this particular effort had been in vain. William Martin. P.S. Inasmuch as I am not certain of your present address, I would appreciate acknowledgement of this letter. And I guess they had moved him back to Leavenworth at this point in June of '67, because that's where he sent this letter. So now we have the letter from Richard Popkin, author of The Second Oswald. This is September 15th, 1967. Dear Jim, I've just heard from Bill Martin that he has another letter from X. Here we go, folks. X. I think we should encourage Bill to stay in contact with him, since it is one of the very few channels that we know. It doesn't look too likely that I shall be able to make the planned trip. Jones will be down to see you soon and will explain. We are investigating an alternative plan for proceeding. I still haven't received the transcript of X's trial, nor Andrew's, nor the reports of Bill's last visit to X, and of Bill's Western trip. It will help a lot if I can get these soon. I learned from Bill that this ad never ran in the Berkeley Barb, so I sent in money today to run it in the next issue. We'll see if anything turns up. The Playboy interview is excellent, and from what I hear is being well received. You may be interested that as a result of my piece, James Phelan came to see me, and Gordon Novell called on the editor of the New York Review of Books. I will tell you about it when I see you. I'll try to get down for part of the Shaw trial. Hope all is going well. With best wishes to you and the family, Dick Popkin. So that's pretty interesting, that they were calling him X in official correspondence. To which Richard Popkin was answered very promptly by Tom Bethel, who was working for Jim Garrison. He says, Dear Dick, thank you for your letter of September 15th. When Bill Martin left here on September 1st, he gave us all the material he had on X, and this did not include the transcript of the trial. Nor do we have any reports on Bill's recent trip to visit X, nor his Western trip. The only material we have is what I already sent you about 3 weeks ago in a big manila envelope. Did you receive this? I suggest the best thing would be for you to deal with Martin direct. I have tried time and again to reach him in the last 3 days without success. His home answering service gave me a wrong number at his office phone, and his old trademark office say they don't know what his new number is. I recently read through the X file, and I must say that I am at a loss to understand why you evidently think there might be something important to this, when one bears in mind that he was in custody before Oswald even went to Mexico, that he is in the everything to gain and nothing to lose position of all other prisoners. Almost daily we get mail from prisoners all over the country with offers to identify Bertrand, etc., and that he alleges possession of a tape recording of people planning the assassination which, even if it were located, would be of almost no value in view of the ease with which such a tape could be forged. This all amounts, in my view, to a very tenuous lead. The information he provides about a Carcano in San Antonio is of interest, as I recently had this corroborated by David Lifton. However, maybe Lifton got it from you. Who knows? We would be interested to know more about Phelan's visit, as he seems to be visiting all the critics for some reason. Hoping all goes well with you. Best wishes, Tom Bethel. So it appears that the gleam is coming off of X, Richard Case Nagell. Even if he has what he says he has, does it really matter? Is it of any value? But obviously Richard Popkin had a really, really big heart-on, because this played into his second Oswald theory. So on March 7th of 68, it prompts him to shoot off a letter to Jim Garrison. Dear Jim, lately I've been working on a theory that I think clarifies the second Oswald problem. I wonder how it fits with what you know about the case. Nagel has constantly claimed that the assassination was planned for September 26th. All of Nagel's actions in mid-September seem to point to some dramatic turning point. He sent a letter to J. Edgar Hoover on the 16th or 17th. The bank episode took place on the 20th, followed by his insistence on telling the FBI about the impending assassination. The second Oswald travel in Wisconsin at this time is also suggestive. If one takes the 26th seriously and then examines Oswald's movements from the 24th to the 26th, as well as Kennedy's and the world's, there seemed to be something startling involved, and an explanation of the second Oswald activity seems clear. 1. Ferry was apparently in Cuba in early September. See Chiambra memo. The more I think about it, the more important the memo seems to me in terms of indicting Ferry's trip to Cuba, the intimate relation of Ferry and Oswald, and Rousseau's involvement with Ferry. 2. The meeting of Shaw, Ferry, and Oswald at Ferry's took place probably on September 16th. 3. Nagel sends letter to Hoover on the 16th or 17th. Nagel given order to assassinate Oswald at this time. 4. Oswald gets a Mexican visa on the 17th. Oswald last seen in New Orleans on the night of the 24th. Oswald leaves New Orleans morning of 25th. Oswald at Selective Service office in Austin the afternoon of the 25th. He is seen in restaurant later that afternoon in Austin. Oswald at Miss Odio's around 7 to 8 on the 25th in Dallas. Oswald calls Mrs. Twyford at 9:50 p.m. in Houston on the 25th. The Warren Commission was unable to find anyone who saw Oswald between New Orleans and Houston. No one on the only possible bus saw him. He did nothing to draw attention to himself. Oswald twice tells Mrs. Twyford that he is about to fly to Mexico. He tells her he wants to come over for a couple hours and tells her he wants to know how they have his address. Twyford was probably the only person outside of the conspiracy in Houston who knew that Oswald existed. Oswald was noticed in the Houston bus terminal around 2 p.m. on September 26th. Oswald draws McFarland's attention on the bus on the morning of September 26th. He tells McFarland he is going to Mexico and Cuba. Oswald goes to Cuban and Russian embassies in Mexico City on the 27th and is carrying evidence of his pro-Castro activities. He goes again on the 28th. He drops out of sight until October 2nd when he leaves for Dallas. On the basis of all this, I offer the following hypothesis. The assassination was planned for the 26th, and the evidence will point to Oswald. On September the 25th, Oswald was flown from New Orleans to Austin and went to an official office to make his presence known. He stays long enough so that he will be remembered the next day. Then he's flown to Dallas. The Odio affair is intended for him to to impress himself upon Miss Odio. So it just goes on with his alleged assertions as the second Oswald. So, I mean, I don't know about Richard Popkin. I read his book a long time ago. He's even saying these second Oswald sightings were laid in the clues were in the furniture store, the Greener's gun shop, the Hutchison grocery store, Oswald's CIA paycheck, $200 less, $11 deductions for taxes. Incidentally, have you seen the message from Nagel that confirms that Oswald was an FBI informer with the number 179? Oswald's whereabouts are unknown for the night of November 8th, and on the 9th, he wrote a strange letter to the Russian embassy, and the Bogart affair occurred. This suggests a meeting was held the 8th. It claims it saw Oswald and Ruby together that night. So it just goes on and on. Interesting stuff. Does Garrison do anything about it? No. Nope. I think he's pretty much done with Richard Case Nagell at this point. But Richard Case Nagell is not done. Now, interesting is where this change of events, this turn of face, comes in at about November of 1968. When we get Nagel writing a letter to a Mr. Greenstein of the New Yorker magazine. He says, I'm sorry for this. That's a horrible copy. He's referring to an article by Edward Epstein called "A Reporter at Large," who refers to him, Richard Case Nagell. He explains in his own words, on September 20th, 1963, I was arrested at El Paso, Texas, and charged with having fired a federally insured bank with intent to rob, and with having attempted to something robbery in violation of Section 221(3)(a), Title 16, whatever. Specifically, I was accused of intended to take by force and violence $100 worth of traveler's checks. After two trials held in May 64 and September 66, respectively, I was convicted and twice sentenced to a maximum term of 10 years in custody of the Attorney General. Most of my ensuing confinement was spent in the El Paso County Jail and at the U.S. Penitentiary, Leavenworth, Kansas. Prior to each trial, I was held at the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. For a examination to determine my mental competency to stand trial. At the time Martin interviewed me in '67, I was at the aforesaid institution for a similar examination as a result of my having been referred for parole. I was not sent to the for psychiatric treatment, nor did I receive any. On each occasion, I was determined, found me mentally competent. Also, before each trial, on merits, a judicial determination found me mentally competent to stand trial. And something hardly accurate reporting to classify the U.S. Medical Center for Federal something as an institution for the criminally insane, as Mr. Epstein had done. I would add that I have never in my life been certified insane by any medical authority, nor have I been adjudicated mentally incompetent in a court of law, notwithstanding conflicting legal and medical opinions as to my mental status on the date of this said offense over 5 years ago. Continuing with Mr. Epstein's references to me, I've never claimed that I purposely got myself arrested in order to provide myself with an alibi for my involvement in the assassination conspiracy. The only times that I have ever given even a partial explanation for my conduct on the date of the alleged offense was in a signed statement given to the FBI on January 4th, 1964. My first trial in May of '64, and in a handwritten testimony dated September 19, 1966, which I had prepared to read at my second trial, but which instead was given to a relative for safekeeping when I was told that I would not be permitted to testify. Regarding the first instance, I shall leave it up to the FBI to disclose the contents of my statement if it so desires. The second instance is abducted to in the appellate court opinion reversing my first conviction, namely that I thought my arrest, could provide a solution, however temporary or immediate, to a problem that I considered at the time to be an unbearable problem with which I was confronted. The third instance, I wrote, the reason I did what I did in the bank 3 years ago was for the sole purpose of having myself arrested and detained temporarily by federal authorities. I have never stated that I was involved in what Mr. Epstein so loosely refers to as the assassination conspiracy. Obviously alluding to Mr. Garrison's findings, the closest I've ever came to Mr. Epstein's fancy was in the aforementioned hand written before Jim Garrison initiated his investigation, in which he stated, I feel it pertinent to advise the court that such testimony will unnecessarily link me. However, obliquely, and I read this before, regarding Mr. Epstein's next reference, that his part in it, he said, had been to kill Oswald, who was the patsy. On June 6, '67, I informed Mr. Martin, precisely as I had informed proper authority on September 13th or 17th, that I had received instructions to take care, to take care of, in quotes, Lee Oswald, that is, to kill him, in September of '63. I refused to elaborate on this matter to Mr. Martin. I gave substantially the same information to Mr. Garrison in New York on May 14th, '68, without elaboration. I've never stated to anybody that I was instructed to shoot Oswald or that I was instructed to kill him after the assassination, as Ramparts, The New Yorker, and other magazines have claimed or indicated at one time or another. Regarding Mr. Epstein's next reference to brain damage that I allegedly sustained in an airplane crash in '57, on November the 28th, 1954, I survived the crash of a B-25 bomber near Friendship International Airport, Baltimore, Maryland. That's a long way from Tokyo. I was hospitalized with a concussion and other injuries at Bolling Air Force Base and at Walter Reed Army Hospital. Subsequent to my recovery, several months later, I appeared before a medical board and was returned to full military duty, which at the time was a counterintelligence assignment. Further, in September of '55, I was granted a final type security clearance of top secret after a thorough investigation which included both a physical and psychiatric examination and a perusal of my medical records. I shall stand by the following excerpt taken from a report of psychiatric examination dated June 17, 1956, by Joseph Aldrich, ND Chief, Neuropsychiatric Service, U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners, which is supported by 5 psychiatrists and neuropsychiatrists, then in residing, blah, blah, blah. I can point out on the basis of my examination and my lab findings, including in the something and psychological testing, that I did not find any evidence or findings suggestible of brain damage of any type. To continue, I have never stated or insisted that I had proof of the conspiracy in the form of tape recordings stashed away in a steamer trunk in California. When Mr. Garrison's investigation was made public, I informed him in writing and through a relative that a friend of mine had in his possession an item of physical evidence which would substantiate the existence of a conspiracy to murder the president during the latter part of September 63. To Mr. Martin, I stated verbally that the item was my property, that it consisted of a small composite recording tape kept for me by a friend, which, when played, would reveal 4 voices, one of them belonging to Mr. Oswald. I further stated to Mr. Martin at the beginning of the conversation recorded on the tape would be in the Spanish language, that it had been recorded at Houston, Texas between August 23rd and 27th, and that the conversation, I don't know what that is. The conversation was in English. It was Mr. Martin who advised me in writing that my friend had told him that the aforementioned item of physical evidence was the subject of a burglary sometime in 64. And I have never made the statement attributed to me by Mr. Epstein that they've stolen the tapes. Lastly, I've never made any statement to the effect that the plan was to have him shot as a cop killer in the Texas theater while resisting arrest. This is in regard to Mr. Epstein taking the liberty to claim the whole thing was one of Nagel's tales. Needless to say, I'm asking for a retraction of Mr. Epstein's allegations and innuendos concerning me, and I request that it be set forth in the same publication that printed Mr. Epstein's tall tale. Very truly yours, Richard Case Nagell. Again, ramblings of a madman. And I think it is a valid point that, he was medically cleared by the United States Armed Forces after said, plane wreck. Very interesting. And here's an interesting FBI document from November 21st, 1968. The typewritten pages caption Richard von Kleist, which I read at the beginning of the show, containing information concerning a letter allegedly written by Richard Case Nagell on 8/13/63 to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, informing him of Oswald's plan to kill President Kennedy. So it goes on to say, Richard Case Nagell personally appeared at the New York office on November 19th, 68, and stated that he has given the information contained in number 1 above, that'd be the letter, to SAS Edward Murphy and Lawrence Gorman of the El Paso office, where he was arrested by the FBI on January 6, 64 for attempted bank robbery. He insisted that he did not give the information to anyone else. Nagell said he obtained copies of these handwritten pages from his friend, Arthur Greenstein. Now you remember the Dear Mr. Greenstein letter from the New Yorker, right? Greenstein informed him that he received the information from Donald Finsterwald, assistant of Jim Garrison. Finsterwald reportedly received the information from either Gladys Ruth, a Los Angeles attorney, or from Richard von Kleist, a resident of California. They allegedly received the information from Robert Clayton Buick, who served time with Nagell at McNeil Penitentiary in February and March of 66. That's an interesting little tidbit there. Nagell insisted that this was not so and indicated that someone in the El Paso office released the information to an unauthorized person. Nagel's letter to the Bureau is referred to in the report of S.A. David Reed at El Paso, dated June 9th, 64, entitled Richard Case Nagell, a.k.a. Espionage X Bureau File. Page 58 of this report sets out that no record of this letter could be located. No action is taken among or by the New York office in this matter. It is being furnished for informational purposes by Airtel, since Nagell said that if action was not immediately taken, he would go to higher authorities, and it is possible that inquiry may be made of the Bureau from other sources. So, very interesting stuff, and interesting that Robert Clayton Buick's name get brought up here. I believe he has a book on the JFK assassination. Feel free to check it out. We shall close out our look here at Mr. X, Richard Case Nagell, with this letter from May 13th, 1976. Forwarded to the FBI. Dear Redacted, got your letter of May 7th. Robert Morrow may have leveled with you when he acknowledged that he'd used the Carson pseudonym by design. However, his claim that it was one of Fillmore's aliases while employed with the CIA is off base. As for Congressman Asshole Edwards, if he places my 2 registered letters to him in the same category as those thousands of letters received on the topic of the FBI's destruction of Oswald's note, well, piss on him too. If Edwards and his staff can't find my letter of 11/21/75, which accompanied the original copy of my affidavit, and a certain 42-page memorandum, this should alert him to other possibilities. Along those lines, FBI Director Kelly's carefully worded advisement that no record has ever been found of the receipt of my September 63 letter to Director Hoover shouldn't have been accepted as the last word on the subject, particularly in view of the record of past cover-ups by that agency. Kelly's reply doesn't mean that the letter wasn't sent anymore. Then it means that the letter wasn't received. I have the receipts for almost every letter I've ever sent by registered mail, just as I have duplicates of the letters themselves. You can bet on it. And Kelly, Edwards, and all the other liars, cheats, and double-crossers had better think about that. The fact that I've never revealed the exact date that my September 63 letter to Hoover was mailed, or the fact that I've never divulged the full contents of that letter, indicates absolutely zilch. The only remaining thing that I have to say on the subject at this point in time is that my 11/21/75 affidavit and my stated willingness to undergo a polygraph examination was the last good faith gesture that I shall ever make to a representative or official of the United States government. A Xerox copy of my affidavit was also sent to Kelly, and I have never received a response. So fuck 'em all. I know little about the fella who once resided in San Antonio. I think he was a Trotskyist or Cowist type. R.E. The other questions tossed. I assume you're referring to the paper FPCC chapter in New Orleans circa 63. If so, the answer is no. It started out as a scam to establish a bona fide for use in checking on something in another state. Strictly tangential. That's all I can say. My Leopoldo wouldn't have been welcomed at the Cuban embassy. And C, no, I don't. And I don't know the answer or the question asked. I think you had best forget about telling any story about me. I don't see how it could be done without having certain matters traced back to me. Besides, who gives a damn at this point anyway? In a number of my letters to Arthur Gilman Greenstein, I jotted down some cryptic, seemingly silly thoughts under the heading of cerebrations, which was the only safe way that I could get a portion of what I wanted to say out of prison and on the record, so to speak, or so I felt. After my release, I had cause to believe that I had sent them to the wrong person. Anyway, in looking through my Greenstein file today, I came across one letter containing some of my cerebrations, which I feel may be of interest someday, again, for the record, as the letter was written on 10/13/67. You have to read between the lines, sideways, backwards, and upside down. Sincerely, Richard Case Nagell. Enclosed is your copy of the 2-page handwritten letter dated 10/13/67 from Richard Case Nagell to Arthur Greenstein with the mailing envelope. Have fun combing through the clues. And this is about the time in his life when he came upon Dick Russell, author Dick Russell, not Senator Dick Russell, and who he began, the seemingly long relationship with that evolved into the book, The Man Who Knew Too Much. Make of it what you will. Nothing concrete ever did manage to come out of this thing. I qualify it as who in the hell knows. Is it interesting? Hell yeah. Is it crazy? Hell yeah. So what do you think of Jim Garrison's original Mr. X? Let me know, folks. Stay safe. Peace.